So we are going to continue here with the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus. We spent the end of the last episode recapping where we are in the dialogue. We spent some time talking about the various tributaries that we have taken, and although it may seem that while on this tributary we are taking a diversion off of the main path of the river, but that's not entirely true, because not only do we learn the landscape, but we learn what it means to take the thought of a theory or a hypothesis, bring it to its conclusion, but it's more than that, because throughout the process we gain the experience. And it's not just the experience of satisfactorily falsifying something. Through each tributary, although again not on the same trajectory as the main river, there are little nuggets of information and thought that we can keep with ourselves to continue our journey, sort of as fuel. And so we return to the main portion of our river. We've been talking, just generally, this dialogue is about epistemology, that is about knowledge. The fundamental question here is, what is knowledge? And we took a rather long tributary that led us back to the question, what is knowledge? So now we are discussing false judgment. It's perhaps one of these things that, like many things, we go on through our day-to-day and we don't necessarily question. It's one of the fundamentals that are assumed. But as soon as they are questioned and our reasoning made explicit, it seems a bit more of a complicated matter. Although fundamental, I think we understand that if there is a mistake somewhere within our fundament, then it is imperative that we correct it. Now, I'm not saying that they are finding some major mistake here, but I'm just saying that although many would readily say that they understand what a false judgment is, I think that it does deserve a bit of thought. Moreover, from that, where we are now, I think, is it's either another tributary, or it is going to facilitate further movement along this path and this dialogue towards understanding knowledge. So I'm going to reread parts that I have read already in the last episode. Not too many, but perhaps a page or so, just to recap. But in general, we've been thinking about other judging. This is the term that Socrates is using for false judgment. And what he means by that is to place one thing for another. So we can have our inner dialogue, thinking about one thing and making a judgment. But this judgment, and the thing that we are thinking about, is false because it is misplaced for another thing. The thing that truly is. So on the topic of thinking, Socrates says, now when a man's thought is accomplishing this false judgment or other judgment, isn't it essential that he should be thinking of either one or both of these two things? Now Theaetetus says it is essential, either both together or each in turn. Now Socrates says, now by thinking, do you mean the same as I do? What do you mean by it? Socrates says, a talk which the soul has with itself about the objects under its consideration. Of course, I'm only telling you my idea in all ignorance, but this is the kind of picture I have of it. It seems to me that the soul, when it thinks, is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms and denies. And when it arrives at something definite, either by a gradual process or a sudden leap, when it affirms one thing consistently and without divided counsel, we call this its judgment. So, in my view, to judge is to make a statement. And a judgment is a statement which is not addressed to another person or spoken aloud, but silently addressed to oneself. And what do you think? Theaetetus says, I agree with that. Socrates continues, so that when a man judges one thing to be another, what he is doing, apparently, is to say to himself that one thing is the other. Yes, of course. Now try to think if you have ever said to yourself, surely the beautiful is ugly, or the unjust is certainly just, or, to put it in most general terms, have you ever tried to persuade yourself that surely one thing is another? Wouldn't the very opposite of this be the truth? Wouldn't the truth be that not even in your sleep have you ever gone so far as to say to yourself, no doubt the odd is even, or anything of that kind? Theaetetus says, yes, that's so. And do you think that anyone else, in his right mind or out of it, ever ventured seriously to tell himself, with the hope of winning his own assent, that a cow must be a horse, or two must be one? No, indeed I don't. Well, then, if to make a statement to oneself is to judge, no one who makes a statement, that is, a judgment, about both things, getting hold of both, with his soul, can state or judge that one is the other. And you, in your turn, must let this form of words pass. What I mean by it is this: no one judges the ugly is beautiful, or makes any other such judgment. All right, Socrates, I pass it, and I think you're right. Thus a man who has both things before his mind, when he judges, cannot possibly judge that one is the other. Theaetetus says, so it seems. But if he has only one of them before his mind in judging, and the other is not present to him at all, he will never judge that one is the other. Theaetetus says that's true, for he would have to have hold also of the one that is not present to his judgment. Then other judging is not possible for anyone either when he has both things present to him in judgment, or when he has only one. So, if anyone is going to define false judgment as heterodoxy, he will say nothing. He will be saying nothing. The existence of false judgment in us cannot be shown in this way any more than by our previous approaches. It seems not. And yet, Theaetetus, if it is not shown to exist, we shall be driven into admitting a number of absurdities. And what would they be? I'm not going to tell you until I have tried every possible way of looking at this matter. I should be ashamed to see us forced into making the kind of admissions I mean while we are still in difficulties. If we find what we are after and become free men, then we will turn round and talk about how these things happen to other people, having secured our own persons against ridicule. While if we can't find any way of extricating ourselves, then I suppose we shall be laid now, like seasick passengers, and give ourselves into the hands of the argument, and let it trample all over us, and do what it likes with us. And now let me tell you where I see a way still open to this inquiry. So a person with two things in mind, again, assuming that the soul has grasped them, he understands these two things. He is not liable to, by force of conviction, say that one thing is another without making a joke or attempting to self-deceive, but there is at some level that the individual understands the truth of the matter. And in the case of having one thing in mind, but the other being absent, any sort of idea of this thing that it could be, then it's not possible that one can attribute the thing that is to the thing that is not known. So let's continue. Theaetetus says, "Yes, do tell me. I'm going to maintain that we were wrong to agree that it is impossible for a man to be in error through judging that things he knows are things he doesn't know. In a way, it is possible." Theaetetus says, "Now I wonder if you mean the same thing as I too suspected at the time when we suggested it was like that. I mean that sometimes I, who know Socrates, have seen someone else in the distance whom I don't know and thought it to be Socrates, whom I do know. In a case like that, the sort of thing you are referring to does happen." Socrates says, "But didn't we recoil from this suggestion because it made us not know, when we do know, things which we know?" So what can be said of what Theaetetus said here and the response by Socrates? So Theaetetus is imagining a scenario in which he perceives that the person in the distance is Socrates because there's something about his vision that reminds him of the memory of Socrates, something about the form and the shape of him, perhaps the movement and body language, whatever. But as the resolution increases, perhaps as he approaches this person, he understands and recognizes that it is not Socrates. But the reason that that judgment was made was based on limited information. And as the information and the quality of the information increased, a more accurate judgment or solution was reached. Now Socrates, in response to that, says, "But didn't we recoil from this suggestion because it made us not know, when we do know, things which we know?" Now I don't have much to say to that at face value, because I think that it requires a little bit more fleshing out. Theaetetus says, "Yes, we certainly did." Then don't let us put the case in that way. Let's try another way. It may prove amenable, or it may be obstinate. But the fact is, we are in such an extremity that we need to turn every argument over and over and test it from all sides. Now see if there is anything in this. Is it possible to learn something you didn't know before? Theaetetus says, "Surely it is." And again another, and yet another thing. Well, why not? Now I want you to suppose, for the sake of the argument, that we have in our souls a block of wax, larger in one person, smaller in another, and of purer wax in one case, dirtier in another. In some men rather hard, in others rather soft, while in some it is of the proper consistency. Theaetetus says, "All right, I'm supposing that. We may look upon it, then, as a gift of memory, the mother of the muses. We make impressions upon this of everything we wish to remember among the things we have seen or heard or thought of ourselves. We hold the wax under our perceptions and thoughts and take a stamp from them. In the way in which we take the imprints of signet rings. Whatever is impressed upon the wax, we remember, and know so long as the image remains in the wax. Whatever is obliterated or cannot be impressed, we forget and do not know. Theaetetus says, let that be our supposition. So let's pause here and reflect on what is said. So first and foremost, there is a mention, memory, the mother of the muses. So the question is, well, what are the muses? Now the expression, the mother of the muses, refers to the goddess Mnemosyne. This is obviously a Greek god. She was the Titaness of memory, and she was the mother of 9 muses, who were the goddesses of inspiration in various arts and sciences. Now the mother of the muses, this Greek goddess that we were talking about, she's considered the source and origin of creative inspiration and the embodiment of memory. Now, the muses were believed to be the patrons of poetry, music, dance, and other artistic and intellectual pursuits. So quite literally, what we're talking about here is memory as we know it. Under the Greek mythology, the definition and understanding of this memory is something that underscores the idea that creativity and inspiration are rooted in remembering and recalling past experiences, knowledge, and ideas. So within this wax, just like with the signet ring, which is the ring that one pushes into the wax, sort of like an envelope, it contains it expresses some sort of seal. So again, upon this block of wax, we impress our perceptions and our thoughts. So now we have some sort of representation, something that saves information. Obviously it's memory. Now interestingly, Socrates says, whatever is impressed upon the wax we remember, and know so long as the image remains in the wax. Whatever is obliterated or cannot be impressed, we forget and do not know. So we have the ability to store memories. That can be perceptions and thoughts. We also have the recognition of the finitude of our impression in this ball of wax. And that can influence what we know, what we understand. Socrates continues, he says, then take the case of a man who knows these things, but is also considering something he is seeing or hearing, and see if he might judge falsely in this way. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, now we have memory, which has been encoded into the mind. Now it is being faced with a representation of reality. It's a comparative example. We are comparing sensory information to what we know in the past, or what we understand based on our past experiences through our memory. Theaetetus says, in what kind of way? Socrates says, in thinking of things which he knows, sometimes that they are things which he knows, and sometimes that they are things which he doesn't know. These cases being what at an earlier stage we wrongly admitted to be impossible. Theaetetus says, "And what do you say now?" We must begin this discussion by making certain distinctions. We must make it clear that it is impossible to think, 1, that a thing you know, because you possess a record of it in your soul, but which you are not perceiving, is another thing which you know. You have its imprint too, but are not perceiving. 2, that a thing you know is something you do not know and do not have the seal of. 3, that a thing you don't know is another thing that you don't know. 4, that a thing you don't know is a thing you know. Again, it is impossible to think that 1, that a thing that you are perceiving is another thing that you are perceiving. 2, that a thing you are perceiving is a thing which you are not perceiving. 3, that a thing you are not perceiving is another thing that you are not perceiving. 4, that a thing you are not perceiving is a thing you are perceiving. Yet again, it is impossible to think 1, that a thing you both know and are perceiving, when you are holding its imprint in line with your perception of it, is another thing which you know and are perceiving, and whose imprint you keep in line with the perception. This indeed is even more impossible than the former cases, if that can be. 2, that a thing which you both know and are perceiving, and the record of which you are keeping in its true line, is another thing you know. 3, that a thing you both know and are perceiving, and of which you have the record correctly in line as before, is another thing you are perceiving. 4, that a thing you neither know nor are perceiving is another thing you know, is another thing you neither know nor perceive. 5, that a thing you neither know nor perceive is another thing you don't know. 6, that a thing you neither know nor perceive is another thing you are not perceiving. In all these cases, it is a sheer impossibility that there should be false judgment. It remains that it arises, if anywhere, in the cases I am just going to tell you. Okay, so I think it's worth going back into some of these and maybe thinking about them. It's a lot of confusing language here. But let's start with the end, when he says, in all these cases, it is a sheer impossibility that there should be false judgment. It remains that it arises, if anywhere, in the cases I'm just going to tell you. And when he begins, he says, we must begin this discussion by making certain distinctions. We must make it clear that it is impossible to think, and then he goes from there. Another thing to add, I think, when Socrates is going through these things, in my mind at least, I go through my mind has a preference, and it would like to go through and find something that says, no, this statement, although it's meant to be a totalizing statement, I found a hole in it, and this can't be true. However, I think that way of thinking can lead to some limitation. It can narrow the pursuit of understanding what knowing is. So let's go through this. Number 1, that a thing you know because you possess the record of it in your soul. So let's just say you have a memory of something. You're sitting staring at nothing, and you're thinking about certain things. You pull up one thing in your mind, let's say, whatever it might be an object. You're not currently perceiving it, and then you pull up another thing out of your memory, another object. Now you clearly know the difference between the two, because you pull them up separately. They have their own distinctions in your mind. If you aren't able to do so, either you don't know it, or it's the same object. There would be no boundaries between the two thoughts or memories. But of course they are. So now the second one he mentions, that a thing you know is something you do not know and do not have the seal of. So what does this mean? So again, we return to our object, the thing that is known. Now it would be a strange thing to pull up an object in the mind and to pretend or to try and convince yourself into thinking that you don't know it. And you don't have the seal of it. That's an interesting way to express that. You don't have the seal of. Now the seal, obviously, it refers to a reference earlier about the signet rings. It has the symbol on the top of it for which you imprint into that wax. So I think it's just another way of referring to memory. So, obviously, if you pull up an object in your mind, and then you go, nope, not the object anymore, and also I don't have the memory of it, that just is not possible. There's no way to even make a false judgment of that. Because by pulling something up in your mind, you've already negated the rest of that sentence. Number 3. That a thing you don't know is another thing you don't know. Well, now this is an interesting one after I read this one, because there are many things for which I know at a certain level, but don't know at another level, or perhaps don't understand at another level. You know, we can say for any material things, any number of material things, that we know the object. But again, given our limitations in terms of our perceptions, there's only so much of that object that we know per se. But again, we've already decided in this dialogue that knowing is not perception, so I suppose we can't go there. And I think it would be prudent to remember that we are considering things for their being, because there are inherent limitations with our own perception. So if we take an object for its being, for what it is, and perceptions aside, that are maybe outside the realm or the boundaries of our grasp, is it still possible that we can say that we know something, but also don't know it? Again, the aspectual part of it aside, I have difficulty imagining how it's possible. Now, in more complicated, maybe organization, perhaps, human organization, social organization, I can see the case that we know at a certain level the behavior of the individual. But then again, at a higher level, we don't know the behavior of a transpersonal agent, let's say. Something that is not directed by one, let's say, but by many. And through the many interactions, it has its own force and its own way about it. Now the question is this similar to that of the material? Because obviously we're going up in the vertical towards the heavenly principle. And if it is the case that the way that we think about these things, that it is a matter of perception, it's a matter of the way that we observe the movement of these things, then we can't really use that either. Because we could still recognize its being, and therefore we recognize that it is a thing. So that in saying that a thing you don't know is another thing you don't know. So if it's something that we don't know, we just don't know it. It's not there. So that's not possible. Now, number 4, that a thing you don't know is a thing you know. Again, it's impossible. You're starting from a void and going from the void to something. That's not possible. Now, he starts over and he says again, like he's going to reiterate himself and repeat it. It is impossible to think that a thing you are perceiving is another thing that you are perceiving. Now this is different than the first, because the first we're talking about memory. We're talking about memory because it is something that we are not currently perceiving. Now in this case, we're talking about two things that we are perceiving. So it's maybe a little bit more of an elevated case. So again, that a thing you are perceiving is another thing that you are perceiving. It's impossible to think that. Now why is that the case? Well, I think it's similar as the first one that we talked about. Once you make the categorization, the objectification, in your mind, you categorize and place a boundary around an object and say that this is a thing. And you can differentiate it, that the boundary of another thing runs up into the boundary of the thing that you just named, and you have two different things that you know. It's impossible that that thing is going to be the same thing as something else, even if it is the same kind of object. Like if we have two quarters, they're two still different things. Now the second one here, a thing you are perceiving is a thing which you are not perceiving. Well, now this reminds me of a sort of psychological phenomenon, which maybe somebody is under the control of another person that is repeatedly telling them that a thing you are perceiving is a thing which you are not perceiving. Sort of a funny anecdote. But that's neither here nor there. Obviously, this is self-explanatory. Now, there are cases of false perception, or severe psychological, psychiatric disturbances, in which a thing that a person thinks that they are perceiving really is something that they're not perceiving, like in the case of schizophrenia. Now, I think pathology aside, we're talking about normal conditions here. A thing you are not perceiving is another thing you are not perceiving. Well, I'm not perceiving it. We're not talking about memory. And so if I'm not perceiving a thing, then how am I going to attribute that not perceiving to something else that I'm also currently not perceiving? A thing you are not perceiving is a thing you are perceiving. Okay, so this is the reverse of the former. Reverse of the number 2, which is a thing you are perceiving is a thing which you are not perceiving. Number 4 is a thing you are not perceiving is a thing you are perceiving. So again, information has to come in from the environment in order for us to perceive. If that information is not there, we are not going to be perceiving it. Now his last 6 points here, I think, can be a little bit more confusing. He says it's impossible to think that, number 1, that a thing you both know and are perceiving when you are holding its imprint in line with your perception of it. Okay, so you're comparing your memory to your perception, is another thing which you know and are perceiving, and whose imprint you keep in line with the perception. So this is just a variation of the first 2, essentially. Instead of just memory, we have memory now, and instead of just perceiving, we have memory and perceiving. So we have a comparative. We have something that we have perceived in the past and have made a memory of, and now we are currently perceiving again and comparing it to that memory. And also then comparing that to something else and attributing what we are currently perceiving and comparing to our memory as something completely different to what it actually is. That it is, in fact, another one of these processes. It is something of a different memory, something of a different perception. No, that's not the case. Now, he even goes as far as to say, in parentheses, this is indeed even more impossible than the former cases, if that can be. Now, number 2, that a thing which you both know and are perceiving, and the record of which you are keeping in its true line, is another thing which you know. So this is a case of perceiving something. That something is happening in the environment, we are taking in the information, we are comparing it to a positive memory that is the same as something that we do indeed remember. So we do indeed know this thing. I'll say know loosely here. And the record of which you are keeping in its true line is another thing you know. Now, what of this example? Now, is it possible to know something, to have a memory of something, and to perceive of something that is in line with the perception, you remembered accurately, and then all of a sudden to say, this is another thing that I know? It doesn't seem quite to make sense. Now, that's not to say that it can't be something that's like something else, but again, it's about boundaries. We all have to separate boundaries from one another. In front of me, I'm looking at 2 different calculators. They are not the same brand of calculator, but I do know one of them. I can't remember what the number is, the T something. But I do know this calculator. I've seen it before. I've seen the object before. I know the product. The calculator that's beside it, I have never seen before. It's a different shape. I don't know the brand. But I'm not readily going to say that the thing that I am perceiving and remembering is something else entirely, is the thing that it's sitting next to, because of course it's not. Now, number 3, that a thing you both know and are perceiving, and of which you have record correctly in line as before, is another thing that you are perceiving. Again, I sort of just already went through this. Instead of, my previous example, instead of what Socrates was saying, I have something else in mind. Literally in front of me, there's 2 calculators. So we sort of went through this mental exercise, and I think we understand conceptually that this is not, and it cannot be the case. Number 5 is that a thing you neither know nor perceive is another thing you don't know. Again, this is another case of starting with nothing. I guess it could be the case, well, I know nothing, so nothing is another nothing. Well, that doesn't really make sense. There's nothing there. There's no there. There's no thing. There's no object. There's no categorization. There's no differentiation. There's nothing purposeful or meaningful there. That a thing you neither know nor perceive is another thing you are not perceiving. Again, we neither know it, it's not in our memory, and we're not currently perceiving it. It's not possible that this nothingness is somehow something else that we are not perceiving, because there's no thing, there's no boundary around something to compare it to. We can't make a false judgment there. So again, in all these cases, it is a sheer impossibility that there should be false judgment. It remains that it arises, if anywhere, in the cases I am just going to tell you. Theaetetus says, what are they? Perhaps I may understand a little better from them. At present, I don't follow. I'll go over it again in another way. I know Theodorus, and remember within myself what he is like, and in the same way I know Theaetetus. But sometimes I am seeing them and sometimes not. Sometimes I am touching them, and sometimes not. Or I may hear them or perceive them through some other sense, while at other times I have no perception about you two at all, but remember you nonetheless, and know you within myself. Isn't that so? Theaetetus says, yes, certainly. Now please take this first point that I want to make clear to you, that we sometimes perceive and sometimes do not perceive the things that we know. Theaetetus says that's true. Then as regards the things we don't know, we often don't perceive them either, but often we only perceive them. So this is another interesting distinction. So again, of the things that we don't know, it's often the case, remember, the equivalent is not that knowledge is equal to perception. Okay, so we start there. But regarding the things that we don't know, it's often the case that it does parallel the things that we don't perceive. Because perception is big. I think, in terms of knowing, perception, I think, is a big part of it at the very least, although not completely equivalent. But often we only perceive them. When he says we only perceive, he's talking about the thing, or the things. That we only perceive them, which means that if we only perceive something, it may not be attributed to what is considered to be knowing, the knowing of something. Theaetetus says that is also. Now see if you can follow me a little better. Supposing Socrates knows both Theodorus and Theaetetus, but is not seeing either of them, or having any other perception about them. He could never, in that case, judge within himself that Theaetetus was Theodorus. Is that sense or not? Theaetetus says, yes, that's quite true. This, then, was the first of the cases I was speaking of. It was. Secondly, then, supposing I am acquainted with one of you, and not the other, and am perceiving neither of you. In that case, I could never think the one I do know to be the one I don't know. That is so. Thirdly, supposing I am not acquainted with either of you, and I am not perceiving either of you, I could not possibly think that the one of you, whom I don't know, is another of you, whom I don't know. Now will you please take it that you have heard all over again, in succession, the other cases described before, the cases in which I shall never judge falsely about you and Theodorus, either when I am familiar or when I am unfamiliar with both of you, or when I know one but not the other, and similarly with perceptions. You follow me? Theaetetus says, I follow. So there remains the possibility of false judgment in this case. I know both you and Theodorus. I have your signs upon that block of wax, like the imprints of rings. Again, memory. Then I see you both in the distance, but cannot see you well enough. But I am in a hurry to refer the proper sign to the proper visual perception, and so get this fitted into the trace of itself, that recognition may take place. This I fail to do. I get them out of line, applying the visual perception of the one to the sign of the other. It is like people putting their shoes on the wrong foot, or like what happens when we look at the things in the mirrors, when left and right changes places. It is then that heterodoxy, or false judgment, arises. So here we have the case of, this is something that we've heard before in this dialogue, but here we have the case of an understanding and knowing of two things. We have definite boundaries, We have had sufficient perception to fill in these boundaries. Again, perception is not knowing, but it is a strong contributing factor. And we have stamped it. We have made the sign in this block of wax that is our memory. Part of this memory is based on our experiences and our perceptions. Now, when we go and we try to categorize something at a distance with limited information, it is possible that we do make the mistake. In which case, our perception leads us astray. While we clearly know something, the limited information that we take in is not sufficient to fill in the category, to color within the boundaries of things, so that we can accurately compare it to other things. Now my mind continually goes to, okay, well, what is the point at which we can sufficiently color in something to say that we know the thing? But if we continue to maintain that perception is not knowing, then there must be some sort of more sophisticated thing. Perception obviously is in there. Observation is in there. Now I think of the scientific method and the process that entails. There are limitations there, but we need not get into that just yet. So he says that in this case, false judgment arises. So exactly what is false judgment in this case? It would seem that it is a recognition of something that is known, that is drawn from memory, that is misplaced to something else due to a lack of information or some other circumstance. In this case, obviously, they're in the distance, so it has to be limited perception, limited visual information. But it is not a fault of memory. It is not a fault of knowing. In this case. Theaetetus says, yes, that seems very likely, Socrates. It is an awfully good description of what happens to the judgment. Socrates says, then, again, supposing I know both of you, and am also perceiving one of you, and not the other, but am not keeping my knowledge of the former in line with my perception. That's the expression I used before, and you didn't understand me then. Theaetetus says, no, I certainly didn't. Well, I was saying that if you know one man and perceive him as well, and you keep your knowledge of him in line with your perception, you will never take him for some other person whom you know and are perceiving, and the knowledge of whom you are holding straight within the perception. Wasn't that so? Theaetetus says yes. Socrates continues, there remained, I take it, the case we have just mentioned where false judgment arises in the following manner. You know both men, and you are looking at both, or having some perception of them, and you don't hold the two signs, each in line with its own perception. But like a bad archer, you shoot beside the mark and miss, which is precisely what we call falsehood. So this idea of the mark is interesting, because if we hit the mark, our knowledge, or our perception, and the thing is in line with what we know. And if we miss the mark, then our perception is not in line with the thing that we know, which would mean false judgment. And maintaining that perception is not entirely knowledge, but it would seem that it is important, fundamental in this case, for perception to be present in our experience and in our interaction with the world, that it be a proper communicator with the soul, with the supreme integrator, that Ancha, the king of the individual. Theaetetus says, naturally so. And Socrates says, and when for one of the signs there is also a present perception, but there is not for the other, and you try to fit to the present perception the sign belonging to the absent perception, in all cases, thought is in error. Now there's one thing that I wanted to go back and say, or at least mention, that in the analogy of the archer, when we hit the bullseye, let's say, we are properly identifying the thing that is. The mark is the thing that draws our attention. This is what we are aiming at, is what our efforts and our purposes are geared towards. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that our efforts will, and our attention for that matter, will accurately allow us to hit the mark. What allows us to hit the mark is certainly the orientation of attention. It is the focus of the eyes. It is the will, the want to do so. There's the purpose that is behind shooting at a particular target, taking aim at something. But it is also within the practice, within the participation, the repetition, through which we are able to more accurately find our mark. The arrow of perception meets the reality of what is. And also what's interesting here is that the sign can be thought of as the sort of the mental target, because it is information that has been imprinted on our ball of wax. However accurate it is, it's up to us to pay attention to the mark, to the true mark. The better we pay attention, the better we orient ourselves to that mark, the better our sign is going to be, or our memory will be. Now, there are different ways of paying attention. There are different things that we can do, surely, to improve our imprint in the ball of wax, again, which is our memory. But the main point here is the sign is dependent upon our focused utilization of perception, but also the way in which we orient ourselves to the mark. Because certainly there are things for which, if we interact with them in certain ways, the salience increases. Their meaningfulness to us increases, and therefore that imprint on that ball of wax is much more detailed, and it is much less likely that we would mistake one thing for another. Now take, for example, a close family member, and then take, for example, a person of distant acquaintance, right? If you saw them in the hallway or in passing, you might say hi to them, or how are things going. But you would be much sooner to recognize your mother or your father than some acquaintance at a distance. And this is because the sign is much more detailed. The mark has been studied in greater detail. There's more time, there's more interaction. And all of these things, perception is the vehicle through which the information comes in. But the orientation, the intent, the attention, the experiences, all of these sort of things exist on a level that basic perception, just by having a dull and dumb human being just sitting and absorbing information from the environment would be much less. Their memory would be much poorer without all of these other factors and variables. So now to return to the paragraph that we just read about Socrates. And for when one of the signs there is also a present perception, but there is not for the other, and you try to fit the present perception, the sign belonging to the absent perception, in all cases thought is an error. So for one of our chiseled pieces of wax here that our stamp has made an imprint on, we are introducing new information. So perhaps we are retracing that outline for remembrance, or we are both retracing it for remembrance, but also maybe adding some more details. So we have the sign and the perception. Now he says, but there is not for the other. And so you try to fit the present perception. Again, this is our paintbrush or our pencil through which we are drawing or painting upon the canvas of our memory. And you try to fit the present perception, the sign belonging to the absent perception. Now what does that mean? And you try to fit the present perception, okay, the sign belonging to the absent perception. So we have some other memory. Or we have our present perception. And we try to not only, chisel in that information to what we know, but also try and attribute that to something else. Let's say I know my father, but I'm trying to take that information and the current dialogue perhaps that we're having, or the interaction, or whatever it might be, me perceiving him in that moment, and say, hey, you know what, I want this information to chisel or to color in and to firmly categorize the thing that is my mother. Now, of course, that can't happen. And as Socrates says, it seems that in the case of things, or rather, I should say that in all such cases, thought is an error. He continues, he says, we may sum up thus. It seems that in the case of things we do not know, and have never perceived, there is no possibility of error or false judgment, if what we are saying is at all sound. It is in cases where we both know things and are perceiving them that judgment is erratic and varies between truth and falsity. When it brings together the proper stamps and records directly and in straight lines, it is true. When it does so obliquely and crosswise, it is false. Theaetetus says, well, isn't that beautiful, Socrates? When you've heard what is coming next, you will say so all the more. For true judgment is beautiful, right enough, and error is ugly. Theaetetus says, no doubt about that. Well, this, then, they say, is why the two things occur. In some men, the wax in the soul is deep and abundant, smooth and worked into proper consistency, and when the things that come through the senses are imprinted upon his heart of the soul, as Homer calls it, hinting at the likeness to the wax, the signs that are made in it are lasting, because they are clear and have sufficient depth. Men with such souls learn easily and remember what they learn. They do not get the signs out of line with the perceptions, but judge truly, as the signs are distinct and there is plenty of room for them. They quickly assign each thing to its own impress in the wax. The things in question being, of course, what we call the things that are, and these people being the ones we call wise. Or do you feel any doubts about this? Theaetetus says, no, I find it extraordinarily convincing. Now remember the Muses. Remember their mother, who is memory. The Muses were the patrons of poetry, music, dance, and other artistic and intellectual pursuits. Creativity and inspiration are rooted in remembering and recalling past experiences, knowledge, and ideas. So memory, perhaps as we conceive of it, is not a sufficient term. Or perhaps it is a sufficient term, but I should say that my conception of it, I think up until this point, was not sufficient to fully understand what Socrates is trying to say here. Or rather, what he is saying here. And so again, I think that this has to do with salience. Or something like a quality of being noticeable. It is important, it is prominent. It has a place in our landscape that is identifiable above the rest, right? Our creative inspiration comes from that which gives us, I don't want to say that which gives us most, because it's more detailed than that. There's all sorts of gradations, levels, and I guess affordances. I'm saying a bunch of words that probably aren't really coalescing into a unified point here, but the return to salience, again, the prominence of something, the importance of something. The importance of what? What is the thing, and why do we orient our attention towards certain things? Why even bother about determining the nature of the thing as it is? Now, there are all sorts of motivations and sorts of things in here, but I think that to get too far beyond that is a little bit beyond, perhaps, where we should be at the moment. But the direction which this conversation is pointing is definitely towards something that is unified. And I mean, Socrates talks about the one, the capital O-N-E, as sort of this centralizing, orienting figure, the ultimate mark, through which it guides and governs, or should serve as the mark that guides and governs human actions and human behavior. So while we may have a sign for man or a particular person that means something to us, there is a sign for the one, the thing that is maximally orienting, the thing that provides us with the most insights into the nature of all subsidiary things that are. Certainly, at least in part of what Socrates is referring to here, is the ability for this man who has the wax in the soul of sufficient depth and abundance, that is smooth and worked to proper consistency. This is a person who knows how to properly orient their attention. They know how to use the sense perception of the body to chisel this wax, to find the salient things about the the thing of concern, the mark, and to integrate that into that wax. That it's fine, it's detailed, it's beautiful, it's like a sculpture, and they just have it. And so I think part of the conception of the beauty then certainly must be we must have a certain conception of the beauty in order for us, I think, to move forward and to pick out from things, let's say people. I think people are easy examples just because they're so complex. There's plenty of different things that we can focus on in terms of a person. that the person that Socrates is referring to here is the type of person that can pick out not only the relevant things to mark that person, to make a sign of that person, not just the physical characteristics, etc., but able perhaps to develop a connection through the interaction and affordances through that individual to sculpt that wax figure in such a way and so detailed that it is beautiful and it is memorable. And the reason that the person does this, again, it is the source of inspiration. It is because this maximal congruency to the mark is somehow desirable to the human being, to the human spirit, to the human soul, whatever. The signs that are made in it are lasting. Perhaps that's what we're after, because they are clear and have sufficient depth. Men with such souls learn easily and remember what they learn. They do not get the signs out of line with the perceptions, but judge truly. As the signs are distinct, and there is plenty of room for them, they are quickly assigned each thing to its own impress in the wax. Again, as the signs are distinct, and there is plenty of room for them, they quickly assign each thing to its own impress in the wax. The things in question being, of course, what we call the things that are, and these people being the ones we call wise. So the wise ones essentially are artists of sort. They're artists of the mind. They know how to pay attention to the relevant things in order for memories to be what they can be. Their beautiful form, we could say. But, Socrates says, it is a different matter when a man's heart is shaggy, the kind of heart our marvelously knowing poet praises, or when it is dirty and impure and of impure wax, or when it is very soft or hard. Persons in whom the wax is soft are quick to learn, but quick to forget. When the wax is hard, the opposite happens. Those in whom it is shaggy and rugged, a stony thing, with earth or filth mixed all through it, have distinct impressions. So too if the wax is hard, for then the impressions have no depth. Similarly, they are indistinct if the wax is soft, because they quickly run together and are blurred. If, in addition to all this, the impresses in the wax are crowded upon each other for lack of space, because it is only some little scrap of a soul, they are even more indistinct. All such people are liable to false judgment. When they see or hear or think of anything, they can't quickly allot each thing to each impress. They are slow to allot things to impress which do not belong to them, misseeing, mishearing, and misthinking, most of them. And these in turn are the ones we describe as in error about the things that are and ignorant. So there's some good information in this statement by Socrates here. I think the first impression that I would like to state is that it seems as though, and we're talking about the wax, it's our metaphor for memory. It is our impressionable nature. It is the thing that we've discussed that has to do with salience, has to do with what is relevant. It has to do with the soul, the interaction with the soul, and the desire and the purpose therein. It has to do with clarity. It has to do with the sign and the mark. But when we talk about the heart in terms of its optimal conditions or its suboptimal conditions, the thing I think, at least in the first instance, to draw out is the condition itself. That is to say, that there are conditions for which the impressionability of this wax, or the memory of our orientation to reality, is more advantageous or lesser so. He says, but it is a different matter when a man's heart is shaggy. Now, a man's heart, this is the seat of his desires. He says it's a different matter when it is shaggy. Now, shaggy, of course, is something that we might attribute to a dog that is unkempt. It's long hair. It's thick. Or when it is dirty and of impure wax. And so the questions are, well, if it's in this condition, how can one change it? How can one orient properly? Is this a condition of nature, that we are given this block of wax? And some of us are softer, some of us have harder waxes, some of us are the Goldilocks wax. Certainly there's an element to nature. Certain people just process things faster, retain information better. But the pure objective measurement of this sort of thing in the human being, I don't think is sufficient. Because I think we are sufficiently complex. I may regret what I'm about to say, but I think that we are sufficiently complex. And we are sufficiently malleable and pliable. Although it may require a significant amount of suffering. I think that these conditions are subject to change. Or when it is very soft or hard. Persons in whom the wax is soft are quick to learn, but quick to forget. Now, when thinking about my own experience, just sitting here before recording, I was reflecting on the nature of my mind. This is something I come back to often. And how it seems to be, it's predictable in some sense. But the sense in which it is predictable begs and calls into question the thing that is observing the predictability. And I think that this is relevant when it comes to the cases where my mind is just not, let's say it's not warmed up. I think the easiest example would be right after I'd woken up from a night's sleep, this sort of fogginess. But it's more than that. We can also attribute that to, let's say I've woken up, and at the next level, my mind is required, maybe I require of my mind something more significant, perhaps like reading Plato, in which it has to adapt to the demands and the stresses that are placed on it. But again, the irony is that although before I start I may not want to warm that engine up, I may not want to, because it's a painful process, it is bizarrely a painful process, and that is to say that it requires, anything worthwhile requires the orienting of attention. Now ideally, and perhaps this is naive idealism, we would hope and we would expect that a full life would be freer of the type of restrictions that are placed on the mind that make it difficult to orient it to what must be done. But life goes on, and life can be terribly long for some people. And I think that this can often lead to, or perhaps, a condition in which a person is less free to liberate their mind. If they are not in a condition to do so, I imagine two paths in each scenario. You can have a mind that is perhaps controlled, that wishes to be free. You can have a mind that is controlled, that wishes, and that takes comfort and solace within its slavery and its subjection to rule. And you can have a liberated mind that is burdened by the freedom and the responsibilities therein. But you can also have the mind in that condition that capitalizes on its freedom, and that despite the variability and the multiplicity that exists in our reality, for these people, it is easy for them to focus. It is easy for them to grab something in that reality and take aim with their bow to find the mark, shoot the arrow and find that mark. Now, in both of these cases, at least in the case of the liberated mind, I don't think it's entirely the case that the one that has trouble with multiplicity, or the one that has more of an easier time finding unity, I don't think that this can be boiled down to pure processing speed. Surely IQ has something to do with it, which is a processing speed, finding patterns and things like this, but there's more to the human being, I think. And if there is a process, if there is a tradition in which we are involved in the orientation of the mind towards a target, it saves the individuals that have difficulty with their liberty. Now, in the former case, in the case of subjection and of slavery, I think the same can still exist. In a certain sense, the slave or the subject is dependent upon the master for the orienting capacity. Whatever the master is oriented to, the slave is oriented to. And they are not at liberty, for the most part, to think in such a way. Now, after the various revolutions in the 18th century, I think that we've sort of let the cat out of the bag. Now it's a difficult thing to say in that context, because there have been other periods in history in which the cat has been let out, but also subsequently put back into the bag. And that's certainly possible of our day. It has been the case in free societies, modern societies in the 20th century. They had a democratic process, they had their freedom of thought and of expression, and then willfully accepted a despot to rule over their ball of wax, let's say. Persons in whom the wax is soft are quick to learn, but quick to forget. Now, this is the part that has some resonance to my personal experience. This is what kicked off that prior train of thought. Quick to learn, but quick to forget. The information comes in, but given our capacity for orienting to find the mark, it is not chiseled very well into that wax. The impression is poor. Our attention is lacking. Now when the wax is hard, the opposite happens. It's resistant to learning. The information comes in, but it just sort of bounces off of the object. It bounces off of the wax. Those in whom it is shaggy and rugged, a stony thing with earth, filth mixed all through it, have indistinct impressions. Now that is because this ball of wax it already has a distinct and chaotic character to it, or image, because of its shagginess, because of its ruggedness, because it is stony with earth or filth. We can imagine, let's say an artist chooses to carve a carving into a mountainside. Now it's likely that the artist would shave the part of the mountainside that they are going to carve into, so that there's a backdrop, and so that their art doesn't get lost in the natural ruggedness of the terrain. Again, the reason that this is done is to provide perspective. Now, that's not to say that there's going to be a large portion of this mountainside that is sort of a sheer for which the artist can do their rendition, but they do need a relatively smooth surface in order to orient themselves to the center of the image, the center of the image in their minds. And it's also not impossible to carve an image into a rugged mountainside without doing any of the preparatory work. But again, we are then faced with the possibility that the ruggedness and the shagginess of the terrain overshadows the artwork that is in the side of the mountain. And if it does so, if it experiences this overshadowing, then the multiplicity, or all the variation, the ruggedness, the shagginess of our memory will pollute our attention. It'll make it much more difficult for the soul to return back into its cupboard and find the appropriate item that will direct it, that will orient it, that will compare. I think compare is probably a good word to use here. That will compare what it is currently seeing to what it has stored in the past. And if it has done a bad job storing it, or the environment that it has stored it in is unkempt, it's dirty, it's full of rotten food, let's say, in this cupboard, and there are rodents, or there are bugs. Well, the thing to do would be to clean out the cupboard. It would be to disinfect it, to fill it with new food, to decrease the shagginess, to decrease that ruggedness, to clear out the filth. So too, if the wax is hard, for then the impressions have no depth. Similarly, they are indistinct, if the wax is soft, because they quickly run together and are blurred. In addition to all this, impressions in the wax are crowded upon each other for lack of space, because it is only some little scrap of a soul. They are even more indistinct. And so this is another interesting statement, because now here we see we're talking about the wax. We're talking about the impressions upon the wax. We're talking about the impressions that are crowded upon one another for lack of space. And then the reasoning here is because some little scrap of a soul, they are even more indistinct. Now, I think this can be interpreted in a few different ways. Now, the soul could be used interchangeably for the wax here, but I don't think that's entirely correct. It's not all that consistent with what we've been saying. It's more likely that it is, again, it's the grand integrator. It is the carver of the wax. It is the thing that grasps the perception and places it in the appropriate place in the cupboard, that organizes this cupboard. So that when it goes back to open that cupboard, it finds and it knows where it had placed the object before. All such people are liable to false judgment, Socrates says, talking about the ones that leave an indistinct impression in the wax. When they see or hear or think of anything, they can't quickly allot each thing to each impress. They are slow and allot things to impress which do not belong to them, misseeing, mishearing, and misthinking most of them. And these in turn are the ones we describe as in error about the things that are, and ignorant. Now that applies as much to ignorant people as it does to people in general. This principle applies to everybody, the smart and the dull. Theaetetus says, that's exactly it, Socrates. No man could improve on your account. Then are we to say that false judgments do exist in us? Theaetetus says, yes, most empathetically. And true ones, of course. And true ones. And we think we have now reached a satisfactory agreement when we say that these two kinds of judgment certainly exist. Theaetetus says, there's no earthly doubt about it, Socrates. Theaetetus, I'm afraid a garrulous man is really an awful nuisance. Now the word garrulous is pronounced garrulous, and it means excessively talkative, especially on trivial matters. Theaetetus says, why? What are you talking about? Socrates, I'm annoyed with my own stupidity, my own true garrulousness. What else could you call it when a man will keep dragging arguments up and down because he is too slow-witted to reach any conviction, and will not be pulled off any of them? But why should you be annoyed? I am not only annoyed, I am alarmed. I am alarmed of what I may say if someone asks me, so, Socrates, you've discovered false judgment, have you? You have found that it arises not in the relation of perceptions to one another, or of thoughts to one another, but in the connecting of perception with thought? I believe I am very likely to say yes, with an air of flattering myself upon our having made some beautiful discovery. Theaetetus says, well, Socrates, what you have just shown us looks to me quite a presentable thing, anyway. You mean, he goes on, that we would never suppose that a man we are merely thinking of, but not seeing, is a horse which again we are not seeing or touching, but just thinking of, and not perceiving anything else about it? I suppose I shall agree that we do mean this. So in this analogy here, where Socrates sort of ignores what Theaetetus said, and he continues with his quote. So what he's saying is that we would never suppose that thinking about a thing, but not perceiving, is not the same as another thing that we all are also not perceiving or thinking. This is one of Socrates' main points here from the earlier dialogue. So the implications of this are that we can have and we can understand something that is beyond our perception, number one, independent of our perception. And we can also compare it to other things that are also within our ability to grasp, but are not within our perception, immediate perception. And just as when we perceive things, we can readily differentiate them, but not necessarily commit them to memory, because they're trivial. We can also, within our memory of the things that have been ingrained in us, separate them into their own separate spheres that are their own thing. They have a thingness to them. Theaetetus says, yes, and quite rightly. Well then, he goes on, doesn't it follow from this theory that a man couldn't possibly suppose that 11, which he is merely thinking about, is 12, which again he is merely thinking about? Come now, you answer. Well, my answer will be that someone who is seeing or touching them could suppose that 11 are 12, but not with those that he has in his thought. He would never judge this in that way about them. Socrates says, well now, take the case where a man is considering 5 and 7 within himself. I don't mean 7 men and 5 men, or anything of that sort, but 5 and 7 themselves, and records, as we allege, in that waxen block, things among which it is not possible that there should be false judgment. Suppose he is talking to himself about them, and asking himself how many they are. Do you think that, in such a case, it has ever happened that one man thought that they were 11, and said so, while another thought and said that they were 12? Or do all men say and all men think that they are 12? Theaetetus says, oh, good heavens, no. Lots of people would make them 11. And with larger numbers they go wrong still more often. For I suppose what you say is intended to apply to all numbers. Quite right. And I want you to consider whether what happens here is not just this, that a man thinks that 12 itself, the one on the waxen block, is 11. Theaetetus says it certainly looks as if he does. Then haven't we come back to things we were saying at the outset? You see, anyone to whom this happens is thinking that one thing he knows is another thing he knows. And this, we said, was impossible. In fact, it was just this consideration which led us to exclude the possibility of false judgment, because if admitted, it would mean that the same man must, at one and at the same time, both know and not know the same objects. Theaetetus says that's perfectly true. Then we shall have to say that false judgment is something other than a misapplication of thought to perception. Because if this were so, we could never be in error so long as we remained within our thoughts themselves. But as the matter now stands, Either there is no such thing as false judgment, or a man may not know what he knows. Which do you choose? So let's pause here and consider what is being said. So in the first instance, we're talking about a person that is considering the number 5 and 7. Now added together, they make 12. Now Socrates, he says, the record is as we allege. And that waxen block, that chiseled piece, in some sense our memory, things among which it is not possible that there should be false judgment. Suppose he is talking to himself about them, and asking himself how many they are. Do you think that in such a case, it has ever happened that one man thought they were 11 and said so, while another thought and said they were 12? Or do all men say, and all men think, that they are 12? Now, there are two things that I can think here. In the terms of the absolute form of the number 12 and the number 11, regardless of the addition, I think it would be much more difficult to say and convince oneself that 12 is in fact 11. But in the case of a mathematical problem in which we are adding two numbers together, it is much more likely that we would mistake 11 for 12. Now, why might that be the case? Well, because there is greater variability. There is the mark, in some sense, is farther away. Now, we don't know. That's what's interesting here is we don't know that we are after 12. What's on the front of our minds is the addition of 5 and 7. So the interesting thing is, we can mistake the answer 12, but we can also know what 12 is. So in this way, we can know what we don't know. We can know 12, but we cannot know the answer to the problem, which is 12. Now, Theaetetus goes into saying quite rightly that as we increase the complexity of these problems, this will only increase the severity of our incorrectness, let's say. Now Socrates says, and I want you to consider whether what happens here is not just this, that a man thinks that 12 itself, the one on the waxen block, is 11. So it seems as though the reasoning or the road, perhaps the distance that we stand from the target, or even more so when we don't know the target but are given the coordinates for our aim, perhaps, there is in our mind, I think, difficulty in abstracting enough to see what the target really is. Because in the first instance, we really don't know exactly what we are aiming at. Now, if we get the question right, obviously, we will get 12, but in the first instance, when we are examining the question, we don't immediately think 12. We go through the process of thinking about 5, and we think about 7. And then we do the process in our minds. And what is that process? It is determining the target. It is putting the pieces together to find a familiar number and a familiar value, let's say. Now, when Socrates says, now haven't we come back full circle? Anyone to whom this happens is thinking that one thing he knows is another thing he knows. Now, at the outset, we said this was impossible because in order to know something, to continue with the analogy of the wax block, we have chiseled in this wax block the characteristics, everything that makes it distinct from another thing. And to say that the thing that we have characterized, that we have carved into our wax block, is in fact another thing, would seemingly be nonsensical. Socrates says, and this we said was impossible. In fact, it was just this consideration which led us to exclude the possibility of false judgment, because, if admitted, it would mean that the same man must, at one and the same time, both know and not know the same objects. Now, of course, we did admit false judgment, which would mean, then, as we have said before, the same man must, at one and the same time, both know and not know the same objects. And this has to do with the problem of addition that we were talking about with the 5 and the 7, and then the absolute value of the 12. Not literally absolute value, but the form of the 12. And Socrates says, well, we're going to have to say that false judgment is something other than a misapplication of thought to perception. Because if this were so, we could never be in error so long as we remained within our thoughts themselves. Because in the case of the numbers, we have no perception here. We are just thinking of a hypothetical. And as we have discussed before, the misapplication of thought to perception leads to false judgments. Because if we have a perception, we have information that comes in. Either it's explicitly new information or it's information that we've seen before that is impressed upon our wax. And our thoughts are the things that refer back to this wax and look at it. And if a thing is indeed carved into our ball of wax that does not represent the thing that we are perceiving, that they are possibly two different things. Or we have made a misjudgment, a false judgment. He said, Socrates says, in the vein of the misapplication of thought to perception, because if this were so, we could never be in error so long as we remained within our thoughts themselves. But as the matter now stands, either there is no such thing as false judgment, or a man may not know what he knows. Which do you choose? Theaetetus says, you are offering me an impossible choice, Socrates. But I'm afraid the argument will not permit both. Still, we must stop at nothing. Supposing now we were to set about being quite shameless? How? By consenting to say what knowing is like. And why should that be shameless? You don't seem to realize that our whole discussion from the beginning has been an inquiry about knowledge, on the assumption that we do not yet know what it is. Oh, but I do, says Theaetetus. Well, then, don't you think it is a shameless thing that we, who don't know what knowledge is, should pronounce on what knowledge is like? But as a matter of fact, Theaetetus, for some time past our whole method of discussion has been tainted. Time and again we have said, we are acquainted with, and we are not acquainted with. We know, and we do not know. As if we could, to some extent, understand one another, while we were still ignorant of what knowledge is. Or here's another example, if you like. At this very moment, we have again used the words to be ignorant of and to understand, as if these were quite proper expressions for us when we are deprived of knowledge. Theaetetus says, "But how are you going to carry on the discussion at all, Socrates, if you keep off these words?" Now it seems as though this is a good transition point into the concept of somebody that either it's false judgment or somebody knows something that they don't know. And in the sense of their conversation, it would seem they have such a conventional use of the word knowing and the word understanding, even though they seem to be so ignorant of the term knowing. This intuitive understanding seems to supersede that more detailed rationalist account. Now either, as I said, this is a false judgment, or there is something to it, or there is something known just by virtue of the sheer complexity of the information at hand and our perceptive capabilities. Now Socrates says, "Quite impossible for a man like me, but if I were one of the experts in contradiction, I might be able to. If one of those gentlemen were present, he would have commanded us to refrain from them, and would keep coming down upon us heavily for the faults I'm referring to. But since we are no good anyway, why don't I make bold to tell you what knowing is like? It seems to me that this might be of some help." Theaetetus says, "Then do be bold, please. And if you don't keep from using these words, we'll forgive you all right." Well then, have you heard what people are saying nowadays that knowing is? I dare say I have, but I don't remember it at the moment. Well, they say, of course, that it is the having of knowledge. Oh yes, that's true. Let us make a slight change. Let us say, the possession of knowledge. And how would you say that that was different from the first way of putting it? Perhaps it isn't at all, but I will tell you what I think the difference is, and then you must help me examine it. All right, if I can. Well, then, to possess doesn't seem to me to be the same as to have. For instance, suppose a man has bought a coat, and it is at his disposal, but he is not wearing it. We would not say that he has it on, but we would say that he possesses it. Yes, that would be correct. Now look here. Is it possible in this way to possess knowledge and not have it? Suppose a man were to hunt wild birds, pigeons, or something, and make an aviary for them at his house and look after them there. Then, in a sense, I suppose, we might say that he has them all the time, because of course he possesses them. Isn't that so? Yes. But in another sense, he has none of them. It is only that he has acquired a certain power in respect to them, because he has got them under his control in an enclosure of his own. That is to say, he has the power to hunt for any one he likes at any time, and take and have it whenever he chooses, and let it go again. And this he can do as often as he likes. That is so. Well, a little while ago we were equipping souls with I don't know what sort of waxen device. Now let us make in each soul a sort of aviary of all kinds of birds, some in flocks, separate from the others, some in small groups, and others flying about singly, here and there among all the rest. So just as we supposed here, it would seem that Socrates is picking up on what we had just mentioned, about this idea of or the difference perhaps, between one level and another. And the levels have to do with knowing, understanding. Now, obviously, Socrates is going to grace us with a certain type of viewing. I think that'll allow this to be much more palatable than my own assessment. But certainly, there is something to say about this having and possessing business. It would seem that although the terms can be used interchangeably, and I think that I often use them interchangeably, I probably hardly ever use possession, but that's neither here nor there. I think there are subtle differences between the two. It would seem as though that having is something of a less permanent, it's a transitory relationship, whereas the possession seems to be more, as Socrates says, it's a greater power. It is a stronger relationship to possess something rather than just to have it. Again, excluding the interchangeability in common parlance. Now, in the first instance, Socrates is talking about, he's asking Theaetetus, do you know what people typically call knowledge? And he says, Socrates says, that it is the having of knowledge. And then he makes a slight adjustment and he says, the possession of knowledge. Now, going off of what we've just said about the relationship aspect, one being a stronger binding than the other, it would seem then to have knowledge would be something of a more superficial distinction, whereas to possess knowledge would be something that is of greater understanding, perhaps. Now, this could bridge the gap between the use of language, like knowing and understanding, without really having dove into the explicit meaning of what it means to know something. I think about this frequently, especially after reading Theaetetus, considering etymology and the fundamentals of language and of meaning and this sort of thing. There's probably no shortage of examples that are similar to what we are reading here with Socrates and Theaetetus, of that of knowledge. There are so many things that we just sort of take for granted in our everyday speech that if we were to examine every little thing, not only would it be exhausting, but it would take quite a long time to get anything done. And so the having versus the possessing, I think there's utility in both. Certainly, I would say that probably the wise person would possess knowledge rather than just to have it, but certainly they would have it as well. You know, we just came off of talking about the wax that is connected to memory, it's influenced by the soul. It is this blank canvas for which we can chisel out something that is retainable and that we are able to recall. And we talked about the types of individuals and the ways in which this can come about. You have the more superficial aspects. You have the more rugged, the shaggy ball of wax that it's a bit difficult to recall information due to the nature of that structure. It seems to be more chaotic. It's not centralized. It's not focused. In the same way, the having of knowledge is not as, I would suspect, is not as a detailed image as the possessing of knowledge. It's not a detailed sculpture in this wax, the wax of our minds. And then Theaetetus, obviously, when he asks the difference, we have just been explaining it here, but Socrates provides us with another avenue here. It seems like we're going to have to take on this new metaphor/analogy and use it as we've been using this ball of wax. We're slowly reasoning our way through metaphor, the structure of the mind, and he gives us an analogy to birds, to pigeons. He says, now look here, is it possible in this way to possess knowledge and not have it? Suppose a man were to hunt wild birds, pigeons or something, and make an aviary for them at his house, and look after them there. Then, in a sense, I suppose, we might say that he has them all the time, because of course he possesses them. But in another sense, he has none of them. It is only that he has acquired a certain power in respect of them, because he has got them under his control in an enclosure of his own. That is to say, he has the power to hunt for anyone he likes at any time, and take and have in quotes, it whenever he chooses, and let it go again, and this he can do as often as he likes. He continues and he says, well, a little while ago we were equipping souls with I don't know what sort of waxen device. Now let us make in each soul a sort of aviary of all kinds of birds, some in flocks separate from the others, some in small groups, others flying about singly here and there among all the rest. Theaetetus says, all right, let us suppose it made. What then? Then we must say that when we are children, this receptacle is empty, and by the birds we must understand pieces of knowledge. When anyone takes possession of a piece of knowledge, it shuts it up in the pen. We should say that he has learned or has found out the thing of which this is the knowledge and knowing, we should say, is this. So let's add a little bit of color here. Let's round out his analogy. So we've got some guy. We've got birds. We've got a crazy analogy. Now when we talk about the man having the birds when he makes his aviary, he also possesses them. Now a little while ago we made the distinction between the have and the possession. The possession being a stronger relationship than the have. That the possession is something more of a long-term commitment. It transcends certain boundaries. Now within our aviary example here, he has the birds within his possession. So this superficial layer of knowing rests upon possession in this case. And his possession is signified or qualified by the fact that he has the aviary. He is under control. He is in possession of the birds. Now when we say in another sense he has none of them, I think in this sense what Socrates is saying is that the power of possession is drowning out this have or has. Now I'd like to for a moment, just because the soul I think is a large expansive sort of thing, and if we are going to place an image within it, I think we should make that image also an expansive sort of thing. So rather than to visualize a pigeon coop on the top of like a city building that I initially envisioned as an aviary, my poor city conception of an aviary, to actually something that is much larger, probably more true to an aviary, something that has extremely high ceilings, or Perhaps it's more of a metallic mesh type of structure, enough to keep the birds within a certain boundary. But let's just assume that it's large enough to hold flocks of birds that they can stay together, and there is the opportunity to distinguish these flocks of birds from the single bird within this aviary. Now, perhaps this is important because of the nature of that relationship between the birds and that organization. We don't have to get too far into the weeds with this analogy just yet, but we have now an understanding that knowledge is the placing of things under our possession into the aviary. The things that we possess are things that we have learned. This is knowledge. And Socrates refers to childhood as the aviary being empty. And we continually add things into this aviary for our knowing and for our understanding. Now Theaetetus replies and he says, that's a given then. Socrates says, now think. When he hunts again for any one of the pieces of knowledge that he chooses, and takes it and has it, then lets it go again, what words are appropriate here? The same as before, when he took possession of the knowledge, or different ones? You will see my point more clearly in this way. There is an art you call arithmetic, isn't there? Now, obviously, he's going to get into a new analogy here, but let's pause for a moment and try our best to answer his initial question. He says, when he hunts again for any one of the pieces of knowledge that he chooses, and takes it, and has it, then lets it go again, what words are appropriate here? So, we were thinking about, just as we have established before, that this aviary is filled with birds. These birds are a representation of what we know and what we've learned. And so to take something out is to retrieve it, in a sense, from memory. It's to have it. It's to hold it at the front of the mind, let's say. It is to be in an immediate relationship with it. Now, this possession, again, is a long-term, powerful relationship. It's something that we don't easily forget. We don't easily release birds from the aviary. Now, once we have this bird, let's say, what can we call this? When he has it, when he takes it and he has it. Well, in the first instance, as I've sort of alluded to before, it's more of a front-of-the-mind type of experience and relationship. Although it is temporary, is as if we called up the memory and said, okay, here, it's at the center of attention now. It is the mark that I am aiming at least in terms of memory recall and thought. And so this affords contemplation, it affords interaction, it affords a re-examination, or just examination in general. So we'll leave it there and we'll continue. Socrates says, now I want you to think of this as a hunt for pieces of knowledge concerning everything odd and even. All right, I will. It is by virtue of this art, I suppose, that a man both has under his control pieces of knowledge concerning numbers and also hands them over to others? Theaetetus says yes. And we call it teaching when a man hands them over to others, and learning when he gets them handed over to him. And when he has them through possessing them in this aviary of ours, we call that knowing. Yes, certainly. Now you must give your attention to what is coming next. It must surely be true that a man who has completely mastered arithmetic knows all numbers, because there are pieces of knowledge covering all numbers in his soul. of course. And a man so trained may proceed to do some counting, either counting to himself the numbers themselves, or counting something else, one of the external things which have number? Yes, surely. And counting we shall take to be simply a matter of considering how large a number actually is? Yes. Then it looks as if a man were considering something which he knows as if he did not know it, for if we have granted that he knows all numbers, I've no doubt you've had such puzzles put to you. Theaetetus says, I have, yes. Then using our image of processing and hunting for the pigeons, we say that there are two phases of hunting. One before you have possession in order to get possession, and another when you already possess in order to catch and have in your hands what you previously acquired. And in this way, even with things you learned and got the knowledge of long ago, and have known ever since, it is possible to learn them, these same things, all over again. You can take up again and have that knowledge for each of them, which you acquired long ago, but had not ready to hand in your thought. Can't you? And we have to recall that this hunting in the aviary, our pigeons in the aviary are the things that we know, and so our hunting is going back for retrieving. It's another analogy similar to the ball of wax, but not quite. And he says there are two phases of going back into the aviary. One is before you have possession in order to get possession. Okay? Now this is the capture of the birds in the wild, let's say, the knowledge that is unknown. And another, when you already possess in order to catch and have in your hands what you have previously acquired. Again, we've already caught the pigeon, it's in the aviary, now we're going back to retrieve that pigeon in the aviary. And he says, and in this way, even with things you learned and got the knowledge of long ago, and have known ever since, it is possible to learn them, these same things, all over again. Because this aviary is somewhat separate from from what? What is this thing separate from, and what is the nature of the thing that is the other that makes this possible? There seems to be an element of us that I would consider myself talking into this microphone here. This is me, this is the I. I have this relationship. It sounds weird to say it this way, but I have a relationship to myself in such a way that there are many memories in my mind, most of which I am not recalling at this moment because I'm focused on what I'm saying. I'm focused on this dialogue. I'm somewhat focused, to a lesser degree, on the place that I'm at, where I'm sitting, this small dog that's in my lap. This strange separation that we get from thinking about the mind in this way, and the absence of knowing due to the not having of what we possess, I think is very interesting. It's a very interesting conception. Now, there's certainly many instances with me in which the birds just get out of the aviary, and while it may be familiar, maybe a few feathers are left over, it feels like I have to catch the bird all over again and throw it into the aviary. But all jokes aside, I do understand the principle here. You can take up again and have that knowledge of each of them which you acquired long ago, but had not ready to hand in your thought, can't you? Theaetetus says, true. Socrates continues, and he says, now this is what I meant by my question a moment ago. What terms ought we to use about them when we speak of what the arithmetician does when he proceeds to count, or the scholar when he proceeds to read something? Here, it seems, a man who knows something is setting out to learn again from himself things which he already knows. But that would be a very odd thing, Socrates. But are we to say that it is things which he does not know that such a man is going to read and count, remembering that we have granted him knowledge of all the letters and all numbers? That wouldn't be reasonable either. Then would you like us to take this line? Suppose we say we do not mind at all about the names. Let people drag around the terms knowing and learning to their heart's content. We have determined that to possess knowledge is one thing, and to have it is another. Accordingly, we maintain that it is possible for anyone not to possess that which he has possession of, and thus it never happens that he does not know something he knows. But he may yet make a false judgment about it. This is because it is possible for him to have not the knowledge of this thing, but another piece of knowledge instead. When he is hunting for one piece of knowledge, it may happen, as they fly about, that he makes a mistake and gets a hold of one instead of another. It was this that happened when he thought 11 was 12. He got a hold of knowledge of 11 that was in him, instead of the knowledge of 12, as you might catch a ring dove instead of a pigeon. Theaetetus says, yes, that is reasonable now. But when he gets a hold of the one he is trying to get a hold of, then he is free from error. When he does that, he is judging what is. In this way, both true and false judgment exist, and the things that worried us before no longer stand out in our way. I dare say you'll agree with me? Or if not, what line will you take? I agree. Yes. We have now got rid of this not knowing what one knows. For we now find that at no point does it happen that we do not possess what we possess, whether we are in error about anything or not. But it looks to me as if something else more alarming is by way of coming upon us. Theaetetus says, what's that? So let's back up again. Socrates says, now this is what I meant by my question a moment ago. What terms ought we to use about them when we speak of what the arithmetician does when he proceeds to count, or the scholar when he proceeds to read something? Here, it seems, a man who knows something is setting out to learn again from himself things which he already knows. Now Theaetetus obviously responds to this, saying it's funny, it's kind of ridiculous, strange way to think about things. But again, just using this as a tributary to our main river here, let's wander down it and see what's there. So keeping in mind that we're thinking about this aviary, we're thinking about the two conditions in which of knowing, in which one, the first condition is catching the pigeon in the wild, let's say, and then putting it into the aviary. Now we possess it, but to have that transitory relationship, we come back to it. We come back to our aviary and pull the pigeon out of our memory or whatever, and now we both have and possess. Okay. So now what about this idea, this way of thinking, that when we put the pigeon back into the aviary and we come at a later moment to revisit this knowledge or this memory, this pigeon, there is an aspect of it of relearning. Now it depends on the context here. Unfortunately, there are many examples. But I think there is truth to what is said when Socrates is talking about the arithmetician who knows a bunch of things about numbers, and yet he embarks continuously on different journeys. There are aspects of things that he knows, certainly. So he returns to his aviary, he pulls out this pigeon. Now there's something about this moment of having. It's relational, and there is an affordance. That is, there's a certain aspect or quality of this pigeon that affords the arithmetician the relative insight that is required to move further into knowing. And so when Socrates says that a man who knows something is setting out to learn again from himself things which he already knows, it is an expansion, it would seem, an expansion of knowing. You're taking some, not necessarily more primitive form, because you can go up and down that vertical relationship. You can break things apart into their fundamental elements, or you can go up and put things together into a central point. I think that knowing principles, certainly in terms of a bottom-up approach, having fundamental principles and then building up, can be seen in this way, that you grab your principled pigeon and then you do whatever you're going to do with that pigeon in that moment. And through that thought process, through that deliberation, through that hunting and finding again of those basic principles, and then the utilization of that, I think, can lead to something new. But what exactly would that mean for this analogy? Are you mating pigeons and bringing new pigeons into the aviary? It's possible. Expanding knowledge based on things that have already been captured and known? Certainly possible. Socrates says, but are we to say that it is things which he does not know that such a man is going to read and count, remembering that we have granted him knowledge of all the letters and all numbers? Now in this case we're exploring the possibility of undergoing this process of, again, exploration without the knowledge of. But are we to say that it is things which he does not know that such a man is going to read and count? Then no, because we have already said that he has the letters and he has the numbers. Now the reason now for which he does these things cannot be to come to an understanding of the letters and of the numbers. Now Theaetetus understands this, and I think that he says that wouldn't be reasonable. Of course it wouldn't be reasonable. And yet we use these bricks to build something out of. Now it may so happen that we mistake one piece of knowledge that we have for another, or perhaps that we possess for another. We intend to catch one piece of knowledge, one pigeon, but instead we catch another. And in catching the other, we don't recognize our error, and we call this misjudgment or false judgment. But when he gets hold of the one he is trying to get hold of, then he is free from error. When he does that, he is judging what is. In this way, both true and false judgment exist, and the things that worried us before no longer stand in our way. I dare say you'll agree with me. Or, if not, what line will you take? Theaetetus agrees. Yes, we have now got rid of this not knowing what one knows. For we now find at no point does it happen that we do not possess what we possess, whether we are in error about anything or not. But it looks to me as if something else more alarming is by way of coming upon us. Now Theaetetus says, what's that? And so I think I'm going to stop this episode here, and we will continue next time with Theaetetus.